Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining this talk, which we've called Fact and Fiction, about the 12 FAR cap, a planner's view on paths for creation of affordable housing, which will be given by urban planner George Janes. I'm Rachel Levy. I'm the executive director of Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this event with our colleagues from Landmark West, and you'll hear from Sean a bit later on that. So just to quickly introduce the issue, and then I'll explain a little bit about how we'll do the talk this evening. So for several years, it's been a policy goal of the city and state to lift the longstanding cap on residential density in New York City. This is the cap that's known as 12 FAR, which has limited the size of residential buildings for over 50 years. And this is the fourth year since 2016 that the issue has emerged as part of the governor's proposal in the state budget, and has been repeatedly framed as the key to unlocking vast amounts of affordable housing throughout the city. But as you may know, and you'll hear more tonight, there's really nothing in the proposal that would directly lead to affordable housing. And there are much better ways to achieve those goals without potentially unleashing a flood of new development rights, particularly on some of the densest residential neighborhoods in the country, the Upper East and Upper West sides of Manhattan. Last week, we had an interim victory in this campaign when each of the houses in the state legislature released their one house budget bills without this language. And so now the state assembly, the state senate, and the governor's office will be negotiating up until the April 1st budget deadline. And we'll see how this shakes out. It has been defeated each of the times that it has come forward in the past. And one of our strongest champions continues to be State Senator Liz Krueger, who, as chair of the Senate Finance Committee, plays an important role and really understands the issue. So I want to give a special shout out to her office as longstanding allies on this issue and really leaders. Our speaker tonight is George Janes. He is an urban planner with whom Friends has worked very closely on a variety of planning and zoning issues in the past. He has a unique ability to make accessible some of the most complicated planning issues of our time. And, you know, we asked him to delve into this issue after it was defeated last year in the state budget, knowing that it would come up again. And I think what he's put together is an enlightening look at sort of how we got here, what this sort of opaque issue of the 12 FAR cap in something called the multiple dwelling law actually means, and what removing it would do, and how to really create affordable housing throughout the city. After George talks, which will be about 40 minutes or so, we'll have some time for questions. We will keep everyone on mute. We ask that you enter any questions throughout the evening in the chat, and we will relay them to George at the end and have that conversation, which we look forward to. Other housekeeping notes, happy to have your video on or off, whatever you'd like. We are also recording the talk, which we'll post on YouTube and on our website in the next day or two. So it'll be available to watch again if you need a refresher. And with that, I think we are ready to turn it over to George.
Great. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully, yes. All right. People can see it. All right. So super. Rachel, thank you for that. And I hope that I can be accessible and explain this complicated issue to folks, like you said. So generally speaking, you know, New York City has this incredible variety of housing types, right? We have single family homes and with lawns and that range from you know, very large lots to towers, right? Towers on the Upper East Side that are 300, 400 feet tall, and everything in between. And really, since 1916, this has been determined by New York City zoning. This is the building height map from the New York, a detail of it from the 1916 zoning. And the zoning at the time was inspired by this building down here, the Equitable Building, which rose up 40 stories at the lot line in Lower Manhattan. And the city father said that it's time to create some light on the streets and do some limits. But that was 1916, and it was basic. It was only 8 pages long. And in 1929, New York City zoning was limited by the multiple dwelling law, or the MDL, which is a state law. The MDL had many more regulations. It was mostly focused on housing quality, and it is many pages of information, about lighting and the interior lighting, legal windows. There's so much information in there about housing quality. It replaced the new law tenement regulations. But it did also deal with building size and bulk, but that was not its primary focus. And generally it limited residential buildings to no more than 300 feet. And this is the New York Times article that trumpeted the height limit in the multiple dwelling law. In the 1950s, New York City wanted to change its zoning to allow for residential buildings of unlimited height. And in many places, the new zoning would be regulated by floor area ratio and lot coverage, not fixed heights. And this happened, and it's still happening today. This is 200 Amsterdam, which is an R8 district, which has no height limit. So floor area ratio is now limiting size of buildings. Well, what is that? In 1950s, it was a new concept. The building floor area, the amount of space in the building, was limited by the size of the lot and the maximum permitted floor area ratio of the district. So floor area ratio doesn't limit how tall a building is. It just limits how large it can be. So in this often used example, which many of you have probably already seen, these are all the same floor area ratio, 1 FAR. It's just that they can be 1, 2, or 4 stories, depending on how much of the lot they cover. So New York City's new 1961 zoning meant that New York State needed to change the MDL to permit residential towers of unlimited height. So in 1960, New York State eliminated the 300-foot height limit on the MDL and added a 12 FAR cap, and it did so in this report. The 12 FAR was picked because that was the maximum FAR allowed by New York City zoning, the new zoning. Essentially, the state allowed the city to set the 12 FAR cap and then made it law. There's a lot of things you may have heard about where it came from. There's something that the Regional Plan Association had promoted about it, preventing high-rise slums. That is not true. And if you look at a lot of the information that is contemporaneous at the time, this was all about the state supporting the city's zoning. Several times since 1960, there have been efforts to remove the 12 FAR cap, as Rachel was talking about. In 1997, there was a carve out of the 12 FAR cap to allow for older, larger office buildings in Lower Manhattan to be converted into residences. Now, it was limited. It was only affected certain community districts. It only affected certain buildings. But if you had a building, an office building that was more than 12 FAR, you could convert it into residences and still comply with the multiple dwelling law because of that 1997 change. More recently, the effort to remove the cap comes up every year, as Rachel was saying. And the reasons that we're told for doing it, like for more affordable housing or more affordable buildings, are largely not true. And so today, what we're going to go through is try to answer these questions. What will happen if the cap is lifted? Why are people trying to lift the cap? Will it really help with affordable housing? And then what else can we do to produce affordable housing? So what will happen immediately if the 12 FAR cap is lifted? Well, currently, New York City zoning limits residential uses to no more than 12 FAR, like the MDL does. They're consistent. So removing the cap will affect some special permits right away, but not much else would happen immediately. So not much would change without major changes to the zoning. And by major changes, I mean amendments to allow for residences of more than 12 FAR. And if the city had the power to increase density beyond 12 FAR, what would they do? Well, we know exactly what they would do. If the cap were lifted, the city would rezone the Upper East and Upper West Sides, as well as other parts of Manhattan. And we know this because the former Deputy Mayor, Vicky Bean, said so in this amazing exit interview, which is in a podcast. It's posted online. It goes on for an hour. But in that interview, she stated, "We tried for 8 years to get the state to lift a 12 FAR cap. People would ask me, why aren't you rezoning the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, or other parts of Manhattan? The answer is you're pretty much already at the cap, so there's no place to go in terms of adding capacity. So lifting the 12 FAR cap is the major step that would help." Again, if you're really into these things, it's really worthwhile to take a look at that podcast where she was interviewed. So rezonings, as she was saying, would allow for bigger buildings and mandatory inclusionary housing. Mandatory inclusionary, what is that? It is the city's major affordable housing program that is implemented through zoning. There are many other affordable housing programs, but they are not implemented through zoning. This is the major zoning-based affordable housing program. As currently designed, MIH cannot apply to areas that are already at the highest density without lifting the cap. And that's as it's currently designed. And in 2014, the city said that they plan to address this flaw by lifting the cap. So this has been definitely part of the city's policy objectives for years. So where are the high density districts where MIH can't be mapped? So this map shows all the R10 equivalent districts, which are essentially the areas where 12 residential FAR can be reached. So this would be residential districts and some commercial districts. So in central business districts, which are the areas outlined in blue, these districts are often used for office buildings. The red areas, which are the R10 equivalent districts outside the central business districts that can get to 12 FAR, are the areas that Vicky Bean wanted to upzone but couldn't because of the cap. The yellow areas are 10 FAR are R10 districts that can't get to 12 FAR because of special districts. So when you look at that map, that's not very much area. R10 equivalent districts are about 1.5% of New York City's zone land. The R10 equivalent districts outside the central business districts that can get to 12 FAR are less than 1%, 0.8% of New York City's zone land. 43 of the 59 community districts have no land zoned for R10 equivalent. So even if all of the red areas in that map were upzoned to 14 or 16 FAR, the amount of floor area generated by that upzoning would be tiny compared to the city's vacant residential holding capacity. And what is that? What is vacant residential holding capacity? It is the amount of residential space that could be built as of right under zoning right now. So if you have a 10,000 square foot building and zoning allows a 40,000 square foot building, residential building, that means that the lot is 30,000 square feet underbuilt. That is the vacant residential holding capacity. And if you do that calculation on all land that allows for residences in New York City, and you add it all up, all of New York City is about 2.7 billion residential square feet underbuilt. And while it can't be used with 100% efficiency, and some of it can't be used at all, using any reasonable assumption, that is space for millions of New Yorkers right now without upzonings or lifting the cap. And so what does this mean in reality? So vast areas of New York City can produce substantial housing right now under existing zoning. So what we have is, especially in Brooklyn and the Bronx, you have neighborhoods that have single family houses or very low density housing that are zoned for apartment houses. This is in Flatbush. It's an R71 district where the single family houses that were built there 100 years ago are giving way to apartment houses slowly and over time. East Flatbush is similar. It's an R6 district with a bunch of single family houses with driveways, lawns, and garages that can support the R6 building type. Bushwick, where you have, again, a bunch of R6 areas with row houses, 1 and 2 family homes, and they're starting to be redeveloped. So the south side has 168 units, while the north side has 16 units as these areas get redeveloped. So New York City has billions of square feet unbuilt floor area right now without any rezonings. So if supply isn't the issue, and it's not the issue, why are we talking about lifting the 12 FAR cap? And what is the 12 FAR cap really about? So in my opinion, the 12 FAR cap is not about planning and it's not about housing, it's about money. This is where the R10 equivalent districts are. You've seen this map already. And this is where the highest land values are. And you see there's a big overlap between the two. Lifting the 12 FAR cap is about putting more floor area in the places where there is the most dollar value. And big real estate, they want this floor area, I think, for the obvious reasons. It's where they would get their most bang for the buck. But the city also wants more floor area in these places. So why does the city care so much? And to answer that, you need to understand where affordable housing comes from. So I'm going to way oversimplify this, but generally there's 2 buckets. There are public subsidies for affordable housing. Public subsidies for affordable housing are expensive. They require difficult choices. They require government to make difficult choices about where to spend their money. And then 2, developers provide affordable housing in exchange for zoning bonuses, which is essentially free affordable housing because the zoning resolution is paying for it. So the city wants more affordable housing, but doesn't want to have to pay for it. But in the majority of the city, property values are too low to rely upon zoning bonuses. So lifting the cap puts more density where high land values can pay for affordable housing. And this idea that property values are too low in most of the city to rely on zoning bonuses is really important to understand. So a lot of that capacity that we were looking at are in places where the property values are relatively low. So let me explain this map. It shows new affordable housing units built or approved from 2014 to 2021. The size of the circle indicates the number of affordable housing units that were created during that time. The color tells us the ratio between market and affordable units in buildings with affordable housing. So the red circles tell us that most new affordable housing units that were produced are in 100% affordable buildings. 100% affordable buildings are usually subsidized. The yellow circles tell us that most new affordable units are in mixed affordable and market rate buildings. Mixed buildings are often the results of the zoning bonuses and often are not subsidized by taxpayers. Simply, it's really simple. More density here in Manhattan and in parts of Brooklyn means more free, affordable housing. So that's using the zoning resolution to create affordable housing. But using the zoning resolution as a replacement for taxes, which is called zoning for dollars, is nearly always a bad idea. And it's not always a bad idea, but it nearly is. So zoning is a police power. It's intended to regulate the design and use of buildings. It shouldn't be used as a tax. It's a conflicting purpose. So zoning is intended to protect and promote public health, safety, and general welfare. The purpose of residential districts are spelled out in the zoning resolution: to provide sufficient space and appropriate locations for residential development, to protect residential areas against fire and hazards, to promote the most desirable use of land, to promote stability, to protect character, to conserve the values of the land, and to protect the city's tax revenues. So using zoning as a replacement for taxes is often in direct conflict with the basic purpose of regulating land use. It's not intended to maximize returns. That's not what zoning is for. Zoning for dollars is contrary to the mission to protect, promote, and conserve. Increasing density is a tax placed on a few residents to meet citywide goals like affordable housing. If we want more affordable housing, everyone should pay for it. So local elected officials, and I'm very sympathetic because they're given absolutely no good choices. They want affordable housing, they want good land use planning, and they shouldn't have to choose between the two. Further, very high density districts do not produce affordable housing efficiently. The Upper East and Upper West Sides are the most densely populated neighborhoods in America, not New York City, everywhere in the United States, with over 100,000 people per square mile. So very large buildings like these, especially towers, are expensive to build, which makes them bad for affordability. And we can do these right now. If you increase the amount of FAR in this area, that means that you would have even bigger, taller, more expensive buildings. Now, the city explained this to us in 2016, which is the last time we amended zoning for affordability. We changed zoning to allow for prefabricated materials to be easily used. And large buildings like towers can't use these materials. You're not going to see block and plank construction on a 40-story tower. Putting more density in areas with the most density will actually produce more expensive building forms. More expensive building forms will likely further concentrate wealth in these areas because the housing will be more expensive to produce and the people who could buy them will have the money to do so. And good planning principles suggest that new opportunity areas should be located where there's ample infrastructure, good transit access, and sites for development. And the city is doing this in places like Parkchester in the Bronx, where there's new zoning and new development being supported by a new rail station. So, but what about affordable housing in our neighborhoods? Can we get more without subsidy or zoning bonuses? And I think the answer is clearly yes. So the way we do MIH is uncommon. It is not something that is done in very many other places. Most other jurisdictions, dozens if not hundreds of them, including most of them in Westchester County, require multifamily buildings to include at least 10% affordable housing without additional subsidy or bonuses. The de Blasio administration said affordable housing requirements without compensation might be an unconstitutional taking, And so that's why MIH was developed. The idea was is you're compensating developers for requiring affordable housing with extra floor area from the zoning resolution. But the courts have found that modest affordable housing requirements are not a legitimate, are legitimate and are not a taking. And simply the numbers are, if you have 10%, if you have a 10% affordable housing requirement, everything you produce, you will produce much more affordable housing than MIH does, which is essentially around 25% in a much lower number of housing units, housing developments. So MIH's planning goal was to create more economically diverse communities. Yet it still permitted off-site affordability options so that buildings could be income segregated. And it cannot apply to neighborhoods that were already properly zoned, which leads to this uneven production. Remember that map we saw earlier about where affordable housing was being produced? Some neighborhoods got a lot and other neighborhoods got nothing. Affordable housing that affirmatively furthers fair housing, which is something we should all be working toward, would require some affordable housing everywhere development happens. So, possible way forward. First, it needs to be said there's nothing magical about the number 12. There are good and bad buildings that are more than 12 FAR. Some of our predate zoning, or the 1961 zoning. Others are mixed with commercial uses like 432 Park Avenue. And even proponents of keeping the cap have to admit it is odd, mostly because other jurisdictions don't have this cap. So, you know, to me, it doesn't make any sense that Yonkers or New Rochelle could permit a 14 FAR residential district, but New York City can't. But you know, they also don't do that. So it's something they can do, but they don't do. But New York City Planning Commission, they routinely vote contrary to community board recommendations and often against overwhelming public testimony. So what happens in the zoning doesn't necessarily reflect what the public wants. And so would the CPC suddenly start caring more about community interest and what the community wants out of zoning once the cap is lifted and zoning gets amended? And I think it's unlikely. The cap is essentially acting as a guardrail. But revisiting this question every couple of years isn't productive and it's risky, other than the perpetual no. And what are the possible ways forward? So I have 4 options and we'll go through them one by one. Option 1, take the repeal advocates at their word and amend the multiple dwelling law for affordable housing. So you can amend the multiple dwelling law to allow FAR to be exceeded, but only for 100% affordable buildings. The multiple dwelling law already carves out hotels and other Class B residential buildings from the 12 FAR cap. And in that, you could allow no market rate or partially affordable buildings to take advantage, which prevents more zoning for dollars. Now, this is unlikely to make the repeal advocates happy, since this change would likely produce 0 additional units because those buildings are expensive. It also may make it easier to amend the multiple dwelling law later. Option 2, use the 12 FAR cap to do some horse trading. So not all 12 plus FAR buildings are bad, and if the cap was lifted, what other zoning changes could be made in return? So in return for raising or not removing the cap, so go to 14 or 16, could other zoning changes be made? So there are a lot of problems, and I'm not going to go through them because there's an whole other deck about zoning loopholes, but they include the unlimited mechanical deduction, tiny zoning lots, quality housing deductions in towers, and a whole bunch of other loopholes that developers use to create unpredictable building forms. And, could we close some of those loopholes if the 12 FAR cap was lifted through some horse trading? And maybe even link lifting the cap to a 10% affordable housing requirement in every multiple dwelling. So affordable housing goes into every district and not limited to just some. Option 3 is forget lifting the cap and use the multiple dwelling law as a club. So in 2019, Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal tried to do this. She introduced amendments to the multiple dwelling law that would protect against FAR and mechanical deduction abuses. This is around the time the voids were, mechanical voids were very much in discussion. And she proposed using the multiple dwelling law as a solution. And then now her changes never progressed like most of these amendments, but more targeted and better considered amendments might. Over the past 50 years, the multiple dwelling law has been weakened with amendments that are specific to New York City, because the city has repeatedly altered zoning so that it is more permissive than the MDL, by redefining floor area, by changing requirements for yards and courts, and other things as well. So you could say that the constant overruling of community boards, borough presidents, and the public suggests the role of city planning in land use is failing its residents. So state legislators can reimpose limits that have been weakened and close some of the loopholes. Such action, this would be a limit to the power of the city. But it would be a response to a city that is no longer responsive to its citizens regarding land use matters. And it would reverse 2 generations of weakened multiple dwelling law protections. All right, number 4. And number 4 may be the easiest to implement. Say no to the multiple dwelling law and fix the zoning, the R11. This comes from John West, who I see on the call here. The current R10 affordable housing program is broken. It gives a 20% bonus for little affordable housing that is usually placed off site. And currently, you can't get to 12 FAR without some sort of bonus. And that bonus is currently an affordable housing requirement, which just produces so little, it's not proportional to the bonus. So you repeal it and develop the R11 district. The R11 would be limited to 12 FAR residential, but is allowed another 1 FAR for commercial or community facility uses in the building. So for a total of 13 FAR, which is a 30% floor area bonus in line with upzonings that are done for MIH. So the R11 would require affordable housing like MIH. It could also be matched with contextual regulations and tower limitations to produce a more predictable building form. And it fixes the current R10 program, which is one of the broken loopholes, while keeping MIH, which would make it easier to implement than any of the others that are discussed here. And then finally, 5 is something else. There are infinite possibilities regarding what could be done. And we'd like to hear from the folks on the call to see what your thoughts are. Rachel?
Yeah, so I invite anyone to send in comments and questions on the chat. And Sean Corsandi from Landmark West will sort of field some of those questions and pose them to to George.
Happy to. And in the meantime, I'm also putting in the advocacy letter that Friends developed for this very issue that's in the chat. So if you haven't already, feel free to click on that and fill it out, or click on it, bookmark it and save it and send it to all your friends and have them fill it out and send it as well. So far, there's no comments yet, but George, you had mentioned already that number 4 might be the easiest. New York is never about easy things. Do you have a favorite among these 4? Or that's part one. And part two is, of these four, which do you think is most likely to happen, if any? Two-part question.
Well, that's an interesting. So I am not a fan of conflict between different parts of government. I think actually zoning really should be in the realm of the city, and I like the idea of the city fixing their zoning. And the R10 program, the R10 affordability program was developed in the Koch administration, 1987, I think. And it was bad at the time, and it's still bad now. And to fix it, I think would be a real benefit to everybody. So I actually like the fourth option, the R11 option, because it allows MIH to still be used, because that's what we picked in 2014. It would be hard to change it at this point. It does create slightly more density than what we normally see, but we normally see 12 and we're allowed to go to 13. But if you paired that with urban design controls and limitations to things like voids and maybe put even a tower height limit or something like that, something to produce a more predictable building form, I think it could be really, I think it's something that would be really beneficial to everybody, because it would close the loophole and also create more affordable housing in a much more meaningful fashion than the current method.
And while we're there, since there's still no comments in the chat, not to slam New Rochelle and Yonkers, they have not needed to put in some of these protections because people don't want to build at these densities there.
Yes, that's true.
At the same point, how much of this is on the shoulders of city planning not doing its job, or on the developers being overly aggressive? I know recently we've been sparring on an email for a developer who wants to put a hotel with a thrill ride on a stalk in the middle of it in Times Square.
Right.
We can't really trust sanity to rule in New York.
Yeah, well, yeah, I hear you, Sean. But ultimately these decisions are political decisions, and one of the reasons that a lot of crazy things happen is because developers are more savvy politically than most of us, and they have a lot of money to make things happen the way that they want it to happen. And I think the Department of City Planning, there are some great people there and really good professionals, and I think if they were given free rein to fix some things like the R10 program, I think they could come up with great solutions and they could be implementable. It's just that it's not a priority, right? The priority is reviewing things like for more rezonings for more affordable housing. It's going to be reviewing applications for casinos. It's going to be a lot of other things rather than fixing problems which are known but which aren't necessarily headline grabbing, right? And so if we want to see those types of changes happen, it's about trying to make them happen through the political process, which you and Rachel know more about than I do. It's as an observer, I see that's what really matters.
And just buying time here, anybody who doesn't have anything in the chat, you're welcome to raise your hand as well. But maybe one more question is, is there such a thing as too dense? We're not talking Kowloon in Hong Kong. Obviously, the streets and sidewalks are emptier than they were pre-pandemic. Some of us, some lucky few, are even getting seats on subways. But is there a sense that we're approaching a point or reaching a point? Has that ever been defined in America? Are we killing the golden goose?
I'm the wrong person to ask for that. I think the people who are the right people to ask for that are on this call. I'm a planner, and I try to amplify the voices of the people who I work with, right? If the people, and I also believe very strongly that community-based planning is the type of planning we need to do. The people who live in a neighborhood are the people who should decide what that neighborhood should be in the future. And so if they think that it's too dense, or if they're, what is the proper density, that's what it should be. And we should work to try to implement that.
George, why is this even a budget issue?
Oh, it's a budget issue because it puts again, it's for political reasons, right? It puts a ticker, it puts a stopwatch on it. Is that, you have to make a decision by April, and there's going to be horse trading, and people are going to want their pet projects funded, and maybe you can, sell some votes for repealing the MDL for some funding somebody's project in Buffalo, right? It's kind of crazy that this relatively local issue is decided by people locally, and also from upstate and Western New York, right? And so it becomes again the horse trading issue of politics, and it makes it easier to get done. I think that's why it's been strategically placed here. Before 2016, I never saw it as a part of the budget. You would have these little bills that were introduced. Sometimes it was just deleting that line in the MDL. It would be discussed, and there would be hearings, and it would normally not progress out of. It would never progress out of committee. But now it's got, they've got to make a decision on it every year because of that ticking clock.
I was sent a note here. As we know, affordable housing is a smokescreen for developers to get more opportunities to make money. How do we enforce these hopes? I guess it's a question of inherent bribery, but right now in our district on the west side, there's a developer building a grotesquely large building, and there's been units of affordable housing that have been transferred around. And now this is the second development it's been transferred to. The prior one's been sold, and those have been realized and moved to a third location. What's the mechanism in place right now at city planning to check, to review, to see if these units are realized before they can go on to the next? Aren't there basic policy things we can put in place to say, build this before you occupy or get your C of O?
Well, in theory, that's supposed to happen, and it's HPD that's supposed to be checking on these things. You're supposed to get these certificates, which actually list the address and the units of the affordable housing that meets the requirement. But if I may, I would say that not all affordable housing. I mean, there's a lot of affordable housing that's being developed that's 100% affordable, that is essentially you, me, and everybody on this call is subsidizing through HPD subsidies. And a lot of it is deeply affordable. And I know a lot of the headlines focus on the 130% of AMI, the affordable housing, which is really expensive. But there's as you know, I do a lot of work in East Harlem, and there have been some big affordable housing projects, developments, brand new, that are 100% affordable with very deep levels of affordability. So I wouldn't say that all affordable housing projects are, for developers, right? A lot of it is stuff that we pay for, and people live in and are very happy to live in. It's just how we do it, right? And how we do it matters. If we do it through paying taxes, or we do it through zoning. And if we do it through zoning, we're essentially putting the keys in the hands of the developers, saying, give us something, as opposed for taking the responsibility ourselves.
There's another instance in our neighborhood on 84th Street, and again, keeping it to the west side, sorry, Rachel, and Broadway, where there's an adaptive reuse building from 1892. That's called Eagle Court. Stephanos Chen's written about this in the Times. It was adaptively reused. It was something like 100 units, and now it and 2/3 of the block adjoining it are being demolished. It started this week. for plans for 45 units, which will take up more than twice the volume. So volume is a question here that leads into this next question from John West. My sense is that the Upper East and Upper West sides want diverse communities, oops, just slid, but are offended by excessively, and I underscore excessively tall buildings. Isn't removing the FAR cap likely to exasperate height? Is there a way around that if height's being exasperated as a given without affordability?
Yeah. Okay. So removing the FAR cap would definitely bring in taller buildings in tower districts. There's no doubt about it, right? Where else is the floor area going to go? And there are already very tall buildings in tower districts. I think your idea, though, John, about the R11 is matching like redesigning an R11 district with urban design controls and bulk controls that produce a more predictable building form is the solution. So if we're just going to eliminate the FAR cap and then keep everything the same, yeah, you're going to have extraordinarily tall buildings, much bigger than what we're seeing now. And then, Sean, just regarding what you were talking about, essentially losing units and get new development, essentially replacing more units than it produces. That's a problem. That's a problem, and it's something that zoning could address. It is essentially an average maximum unit size in a building. You could still have big units, but then they would have to be balanced with smaller units. We do that already to prevent buildings with too many small units. We could do the same thing on the other side to prevent buildings with too many large units. And it's a big problem on the Upper East and the Upper West side. We saw a building on Madison Avenue and 86th Street. Yeah, it's 210 feet tall and it's got 12 units in it. It had a quadplex. I had to find out what a quadplex was. It is a unit with 4 stories, like a triplex or a duplex.
Centiplex, heptaplex.
Yeah, exactly.
Perplex.
It's a problem because you end up with fewer units in the neighborhood and more building bulk, which is not good for anybody.
There was someone with a hand raised before. Susan, do you have a question or was it covered? I'll jump onto the next one. We can always come back.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Am I muted?
We hear
Hi,
you.
Susan.
Oh, okay. Actually, mine was more of a comment, which I was starting to write. And that basically is, there's no political will in the city to say no to developers. So any change in the FAR, as much as you may think it might help, is not going to be dressed with all of these protections or promises or whatever of affordable housing. And isn't that really the crux of this whole problem? The crux of this whole problem is that affordable housing, they say, oh, we're going to do affordable housing. And then we have all this affordable housing destroyed so that we can have 45 units of obviously upmarket housing. So that really is the crux here. How do you get the citizenry moving toward forcing the city to work? And that seems to be something that we haven't been able to do. And I know you as a planner may not have necessarily, that may not be within your wheelhouse, but surely we need something to spark a public outrage that actually goes somewhere. Because right now it doesn't go anywhere. It just gets frustrated. That was my comment. I'm sorry to not offer a solution, but that's where I am.
It's a fair comment. I think, I have been to enough hearings and provided enough testimony where, there are, 50 people providing testimony and it gets noted and the votes happen the way they were always going to happen. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. but you know, there's a political process, and it's the only process we got. And Susan, you're right. It's not what I do. Right? I'm a planner. I don't do the politics of all of this, the public relations or the whatever it's called. But I know that there are people that do. Right? And what has to happen is that those people need to harness the energy of the people to affect the electeds, right? Because that's what the electeds care about. The electeds care about the energy of the people, and ultimately because the people will vote for them. And if that can be communicated, then you could possibly see some changes.
And I think you keep saying that you want to do what you want to do to reflect the community's wishes, and that seems to fall into this next comment. This is another Susan Simon. Given the fact that CDC does not listen to the community boards or the city council, and we don't elect them, how do we change that? As someone living on the Upper West Side, there's been a plethora of new building, all luxury housing except for one. They do not fit into the cityscape aesthetically, and we have no affordable housing. Most people say, if asked, that we have no city planning in New York City.
Well, the city planning commission are appointed by elected officials. In most jurisdictions, the planning board is supposed to be independent. Well, they are supposed to be independent. In New York City, they tend not to be independent and are largely a spokesperson for the people that appointed them. And so ultimately, over time, as those positions roll off and then they're used up and new people are appointed, hopefully you get better people appointed. And I will say, you know, I'm a big fan of history, and I like reading the old city planning commission reports from you know, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it was different. It wasn't always like it is now. There was debate. There was very often you'd have people filing like minority reports, you know, where they disagreed, and they would document why they disagreed. It was really interesting because they really were much more independent. And there's no reason why they've changed. I mean, there's no legislative reason why the whole process has changed so much. It's really a matter of practice and deference to the elected official that appointed them.
George, I have
George.
a question in the chat. What is your opinion of imposing a height cap? We have them in contextual zones.
Well, okay, so in the highest density districts in New York City, you have contextual districts which have a hard height limit, and then you have tower districts which have no hard height limit, and you also have it in some height factor districts which also have no height. And so you could build unlimited height. It's a decision to decide whether to put a height limit on things, and that would be a consequential decision, right? One of the things that we've discovered is that a lot of the towers, they transfer floor area from neighboring buildings, and so in effect, when a tenement sells their floor area, that tenement is likely not to ever be redeveloped because it can't be any bigger than it is. So there are consequences to that, and I think, but ultimately it's the choice of the people, right? The people need to decide what they want to do, and then they should try to affect politics to get that zoning implemented. So I think after, you know, ultimately it's up to you all what you want, and then work to get the zoning changed to the way you want to have it.
Sounds so simple. Let's do it.
Well, it's not simple, but it's the way it's supposed to work, right? This is how it works in jurisdictions across the country, right? It's you develop a community-based plan, you have a comprehensive plan, you implement it through zoning, and it's not rocket science. It's how it's done most places.
I have another comment here. This one's from John West as well. Rebney claims New York City is built out. Perhaps they only mean Manhattan's R10 areas. However, in my Upper West Side neighborhood, 6 apartment buildings have or are being built in the last 5 years within 3 blocks of my building. Is the city truly built out?
No, absolutely not. It's not even close. I mean, it's almost laughable to like say it's built out. You just have to do the math, right? As I said, it's like 2.7 billion square feet of unbuilt residential holding capacity, and that's even without bonuses, and that's even without any rezonings. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous to say that. It's amazingly ridiculous to say that. Yeah. I think John West knew that when he typed the question.
George, one question from Roberta Semmer. How do people in the community judge if it's too dense or not? How would one make that decision? What do you think are the factors, I guess?
Well, so one of the things that zoning is supposed to protect is community character, right? Now, the character of the Upper East and Upper West Side are big buildings, right? We have a lot of big buildings, but there's a pattern, right? You have big buildings on the avenue, you have low-rise buildings in the mid-block, and that is the urban form, the urban character of most of the Upper East and Upper West Side. Now, you know, many years ago, people decided that we should try to, you know, have more open space, and on the Upper West Side especially, you have many more of these large campuses with towers in the park. But then, you know, effectively, we all decided that that was not going to be the way forward. And we no longer map new zoning districts like that. We still have a few in place that allow for, you know, campus style apartment houses, but we don't promote that anymore. And that's a decision on the character of the place. So, you know, Roberta, I would say, you know, there are objective measures that we could, you know, we can measure, you know, population density and you know, pedestrian counts and, you know, infrastructure utilization and all of these things which would indicate, you know, how dense an area is. But a big part of it is how you feel about your neighborhood. And as you're walking through the neighborhood, right, there are things about it that speak to you, which aren't always objectively measurable. And so, you know, that's why those things come out in a community planning process, which normally feeds into a comprehensive plan, which would develop zoning. And so, you know, I don't want to say it's many things that feed into those decisions.
George, here's maybe one more question. There's a comment in the chat about adaptively reusing office buildings and how that might require a rezoning. And I think in some ways that gets to the issue that, you know, this year, when the proposal to lift the FAR cap came forward in the budget, it's part of a larger package of proposals that the governor has put forward around housing. I don't know, maybe if you could talk just briefly about how this fits into sort of the package of housing proposals this year.
The conversions, right? Okay, so currently in zoning, we can do non-residential conversions to housing. It's geographically limited. We can only do it in like 10 of the 59 community districts. It's limited by building age. In some places it's before 1977, in other places it's before 1961. And the idea is to expand the geographic areas and expand the dates about how old a building has to be to qualify. And I don't think anybody has any problems with doing that. I haven't met one person who said that's a bad idea, not one. Essentially, if you have the means and you want to convert your building, there should be regulations in place that allow it, especially because we already have such regulations for certain geographic areas and for certain buildings, just be expanding where they would apply. And one of the things that you often hear about is, well, you know, there are 12 FAR there are 15 FAR commercial buildings that couldn't be converted because of the 12 FAR cap. Well, we already carved out the 12 FAR cap for conversions already in 1997. We would just have to expand that carve out to permit the conversion of office buildings into residences. I got a question that was sent to me directly, I think by accident. Can I read it?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think we should respect the views of the community in single-family zone districts where the community opposes multifamily dwellings? And that's a really good question, because it's a dilemma for those of us who were accused of being hypocritical because you don't want super talls in Manhattan, but some more taller buildings now zoned in single family housing. So in the planning community, there's been a real push to end single family zoning, to not require and to allow for apartments or 2 families or 3 families in what is now currently single family zones. Now, New York City has very few single family districts, right? As a percentage of land, it's like, I think it's like 15%, in that order of magnitude or less, could be considered single family districts, and that's including Staten Island. So there aren't that many areas like this, but I would say, in my opinion, is that if an area has substantial public investment, like, for instance, a single family neighborhood with a subway stop or subway stops, which there exist, right? There are single family neighborhoods where you have lawns and driveways and garages and a subway stop. And you think, why are we doing that? Because that subway stop is a significant investment that we all make. It's an infrastructure that could serve a much larger population. And I think in those types of situations, there would be an argument to be made that because of the investment the public has made in these areas, that different land use is something that should at least be considered. And it's not a black and white issue, I think, because I do believe in community-based planning, and I think the people that live there really do need to have the first say. But the fact that the public has invested so much in these areas, I think that counts too.
All right. Seeing no more questions, I think we can stop here. I want to thank you, George, for that really wonderful talk, and really delving into these issues that I think are opaque for a lot of people. And so I think the first step of advocacy is public education. So we're happy to have everyone here learning about what this actually means and how it could play out. We are in the midst of the budget cycle, so I would say, everyone continuing to learn about the issue, share this information, writing to your elected officials. Our advocacy letter that Sean put in the chat goes to all of the Manhattan representatives in the state legislature, as well as many of the city elected officials as well. And we'll see what happens this round. And, I think that there are lots of ways forward that could actually produce the affordable housing that I think we all know our city needs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.